This year, your new book, If Mayors Rule the World, will be published. How do you describe the world which is ruled by mayors?
Well, I describe the world as ruled by states, which is the way it's described, the way it is today, and it's a dysfunctional world in which international and collective problems are not solved, and in which states spend more time in competition than in cooperation, in which environmental problems have not been solved, problems of terrorism and trade have not been solved, problems of pandemic diseases have not been solved. It's a world of competition and rivalry, not a world of cooperation. I offer as an alternative a world in which mayors might together cooperate and, as they are already doing in practice, begin to solve some of these problems.
And why this new world should be better than this one than present?
Well, any world is better than the present world. Today is a world of terrorism, war, global warming, disease, poverty, and inequality. I can't imagine any world worse than that. Can you?
Okay, I see. And what about the global problems that governments can cope with? Could it be solved by mayors?
Well, let's take an example of environmental warming, okay, global warming.
Mm-hmm.
For the last 15 years since the Kyoto Protocol, nations have not even lived up to the Kyoto Protocol. Starting 4 years ago in Copenhagen, 184 nations met and basically failed to reach agreement even on Kyoto, let alone something more. Since that time, the 350 particles per million that is the top possible is now at 400 million. We've seen a warming of the atmosphere by several degrees, way more than possible or allowed by geologists and climate scientists. In effect, we have seen nation states come together every year and explain why they can do nothing because of their sovereignty. And the result is that global warming today is worse than ever. There are no agreements, there's no monitoring, and countries continue to pollute through carbon. On the other hand, in cities around the world, cities are actually taking measures to curb global emissions. In Los Angeles, the mayor of Los Angeles improved the carbon emissions in the port of Los Angeles, which is the largest port in the United States, by almost 50%. And since carbon emissions from the port of Los Angeles are 40% of all carbon in Los Angeles, he has cut carbon emissions by 1/5. In New York, Mayor Bloomberg has taken steps to improve the insulation of buildings so that heat doesn't leak in the winter and air conditioning doesn't leak in the summer. Through improvements in insulation in old and new buildings, he has cut carbon emissions in cities. Cities around the world are cooperating in developing pedestrian zones, bike share programs, and other new innovations which have cut back on the use of cars and on the carbon pollution that occurs. So cities are actually one at a time and together taking concrete steps to curtail carbon emissions at a time when nation states are doing nothing.
Yeah, I see. It's very, very interesting. And what is the most difficult issue that mayors have to face with?
Well, the most urgent issue is, in fact, global warming, because until we have a sustainable environment, everything else is in jeopardy. The rising of the seas threatens 60% of the world's population lives on water. So the rising of sea levels threatens, more than half of the world's population. Changes in climate threaten agriculture and productivity and lead to scarcity of water in many places, lead to desertification. So I would say climate change is the most urgent single issue, and it's one of the ones that cities are actually dealing with. But there are issues of immigration, there are issues of terrorism, there are issues of pandemic health plagues, all of which also are not being dealt with by states, which are dysfunctional, but are increasingly being dealt with by cities. And a good example of that is that there's a great deal of, even in terrorism, there's a great deal of city-to-city intelligence cooperation. New York City now has more intelligence detectives in other cities around the world than it does in Washington, D.C. at the Department of Homeland Security, because we have found that intelligence cooperation directly among cities is much more useful in curbing terrorism than dealing with Interpol and national intelligence agencies. So in many different arenas, cities are doing what states are not doing.
Okay. Yeah, I see. And you mentioned developing countries. Is it possible to adapt the idea described in your book if mayors rule the world to the developing countries? I'm wondering if this model will not deepen the gap between the core and periphery.
Well, in the developing world, these problems of pollution, inequality, overpopulation, buses that don't move, and heavy traffic and unemployment are even more severe than the first world. So third world and developing world cities are even more in need of cooperative solutions. They are the ones who suffer most when nation states fail to act, and they are the ones that benefit the most from these new solutions. Another example for you, in Bogota, Mayor Antanas Mocus, the mayor 4 or 5 years ago, developed a new transportation system. You know, all through Latin America, there are buses that run in their own bus zones. But of course, the problem is taxis and trucks and lorries and cars all enter those lanes, make it impossible for buses to move. What they did in Bogota was to build a curb on either side of the bus lane, so they, in fact, created an above-ground subway metro system in which express buses could run alone in these limited access above surface lanes, and that curbed the use of cars. It accelerated the movement of buses. It allowed people to get across town from poor areas to their jobs more quickly, and it had a profound impact on pollution, on unemployment, and on the movement of poor people around the city. So there, a single reform in how you allow buses to run in special dedicated lanes above ground, and that costs only 10% of what it costs to build a metro, has had a profound effect now, not just in Bogota, but in other Latin American cities. There you see a particular impact on inequality, and for example, in Rio, people live in favelas outside the city, and they have a 3 or 4 hour trip to get to the jobs. The new bus lanes mean they only have an hour or 45 minutes instead of 3 hours, and they can get to jobs, and therefore they can deal more with unemployment than they do in other places. So it's particularly in the third world that these cooperative solutions among cities work very well to improve the situation and overcome some of the inequality.
Okay, so the next question, does mayors governing mean the end of a sovereign nation state? Don't you think that in the era of crisis, sovereignty become more important? I mean, even in the European Union member states are returned to the idea of nation states.
Oh, sovereignty is very, very important, and it's a crippling, paralyzing factor that's destroying the possibility of cooperation. The reality is sovereign nations imposing their foolish, dysfunctional will on everybody else. But that's a very bad thing. I'm not arguing that sovereignty is disappearing. I agree with you. Sovereignty is stronger than ever, but it's a serious obstacle. And what cities are doing is going around sovereignty. They are cooperating in spite of sovereignty. They are working together despite the efforts of nation states to prevent them from acting together. So cities are an alternative to sovereignty. Sovereign nations aren't going away. Sovereignty isn't less powerful, it's just less efficient. Sovereignty isn't less present, it's just dysfunctional. So I'm not arguing that sovereignty's disappeared. It's stronger than ever, and it's more dysfunctional than ever. In the 19th century, a sovereign nation could solve its own problems of trade, of employment, of health, of education, and immigration. Today, even the most powerful sovereign nation like the United States can't solve any problems by itself. And the result is sovereignty becomes an impediment and an obstacle to solving global problems. And cities have to find a way to go around it and work together despite the insistence of sovereign nations that they are the powerful ones.
Okay. In the book Consumed, you mentioned the problem of infantile ethic of consumption. Do you think the world ruled by mayors could change the situation so infantile consumers become aware citizens?
Well, consumption and infantilization are driven by global market capitalism. And global market capitalism works together with sovereign nations to impose the will of markets. The G9, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank are all a joint effort of nation states and market capitalism. Cities are in a position to, in effect, oppose both market capitalism in its extreme version and also to oppose the imposition by nation states of sovereign solutions that don't work. So cities are an alternative to state-driven market capitalism.